A billionaire offered me $1 million to stand still and let her bodyguard hit me one time. "One punch," she said. "Take one punch and stay on your feet and the money's yours." She said it the way you'd toss a coin to a street musician, bored and amused in front of a whole party of people just like her, all of them laughing. Because to them, I was the help. A nobody in a catering vest refilling their glasses, and the idea of watching a poor man get knocked down for their entertainment was the most fun they'd had all night. And I needed that money. God, I needed it. So I set down my tray and I said, "Okay," and I took off my jacket. And that's when her bodyguard, this enormous man, the one who was supposed to throw the punch, got a good look at me with my jacket off and the blood drained right out of his face. He stepped back and he turned to the billionaire, and in a voice tight with something close to fear, he said, Ma'am, please call it off. You don't know who this is. Please don't make me do this." And the laughing stopped. I'm going to tell you the whole story, who I used to be, why a bodyguard would rather quit than hit me, and why I'd let myself be humiliated for money in the first place. But let me say one quick thing first. I'm not going to work hard to keep you here. You can decide for yourself. I'll just tell you this is a story about the strongest thing a man can do, and it isn't throwing a punch. If that's a thing you want to hear about, stay in my corner through this one tap subscribe if it earns it. Now, let me tell you about who I was before I was the man in the catering vest. My name is Sonny Vega. I'm bonmoimot years old, and today I work whatever honest job I can get. Catering, warehouse shifts, custodial work, moving furniture, whatever keeps the lights on. But there was a time years ago when a lot of people knew my name, because I was a fighter, a professional, and not just any fighter. I was undefeated. 30-some fights, and not one man ever beat me, and not one man ever once put me on the canvas. They had a name for me back then. They called me the man who was never knocked down, because I never was. You could hit me with everything you had and I would not fall. That was my whole thing. I want to explain what that actually meant, because people hear "never knocked down" and they think it's about a hard head or a thick neck, and it isn't. It's about something underneath that. It's about a thing inside a man that simply will not quit, will not bend, will not give the other fellow the satisfaction of seeing you fold, no matter what's coming. You can train the body to take a hit, sure, but the part that keeps you on your feet when every cell in you is screaming to go down, that part you're either born with or you're not. And I was born with it. My old trainer used to say I had something in my spine that other men just didn't have. I could be hurt, badly hurt. I've been hurt, and I would not fall. I'd plant my feet and I'd take it, and I'd still be standing when the bell rang. That was the whole legend of me, if you want to call it that. Not that I hit the hardest, though I hit plenty hard. It was that I could not be put down. Remember that, because a billionaire was about to bet $1 million that she could do with one hired punch what balmy professional fighters at the top of their game could never manage. She just didn't know it. I was, at one point, one fight away from a championship and the kind of money that changes a family for generations. I had it all lined up, and then I walked away from it at the very top. Gave it all up, the title shot, the fortune, the fame, all of it, and disappeared into regular life, and almost nobody understood why. So, before I tell you about that party and that punch, I have to tell you why I quit, because it's the whole reason I am the man I am, and the whole reason of what I did and didn't do that night. I'm a single dad. My daughter, Pearl, is 6. Her mother, my wife, Anna, passed 2 years ago. She got sick, the fast and terrible kind, and there was nothing all my strength could do about it, which is a lesson a strong man learns hard. So, it's just Pearl and me now, and Pearl is the reason for everything. She's the reason I quit fighting in a way I'll explain, and she's the reason I took off my jacket at that party, and she's the reason this story has the ending it has. Everything I am is downstream of that little girl. I should tell you about Anna, just a little, because she's part of the strength too. The kid went down, and he didn't get up. Not right. There was a stretcher, an ambulance, a hospital. For 3 days, nobody knew if that young man was going to live. For 3 days, I sat in a hospital waiting room, not even allowed in to see him, just sitting there, praying to a God I'd half forgotten, making every promise you make, while a kid with his whole life ahead of him lay in a coma because of my hands, my undefeated hands. I have never been able to fully describe those 3 days to anybody, and I won't pretend to now, but I'll tell you the shape of it. It is one thing to know, in the abstract, that what you do is dangerous. Every fighter knows it. You sign the papers. You understand the risk. You tell yourself the other man signed them too. But it is another thing entirely to stand in a hospital hallway and watch a mother, this kid's mother, go by on her way to her son's bed, and to know that the reason she's there, the reason her boy might not wake up, is your hands. Hands you'd trained for that exact purpose. There's no signing the papers that covers that. I kept looking down at my own hands those 3 days like they belonged to somebody else, like they were two animals I'd been keeping on a leash that had finally gotten loose and done the thing they were always going to do. I'd been telling myself for years that I was an athlete, a craftsman, a competitor, and in that hallway, the truth caught up with me, which was that I was a man who got paid to hurt people, and that I'd gotten so good at it I'd nearly killed somebody's child. I made God a lot of promises in that hallway. The kid woke up on the 3rd day, and I set about keeping every one of them. He lived. Thank God, he lived, and he recovered mostly, though he never fought again. But here's the thing that changed me forever. While I was sitting in that waiting room those 3 days, terrified I'd killed a man, my wife Anna was at home, 9 months pregnant. On the 2nd night, she went into labor, and I had to leave that hospital waiting room and drive to another hospital. I walked out of the worst moment of my life and into the best one. A few hours later, they put my newborn daughter, Pearl, into these same 2 hands. The same hands that had just put a young man in a coma. These hands that had done so much harm, now holding this brand new, perfect, tiny person who trusted them completely. I sat there in that delivery room holding my daughter, and I made her a promise. I promised her that these hands, the hands that had hurt a man so badly I thought I'd killed him, were never, ever going to be used in anger again. That they were going to be hands that held her, fed her, and worked for her. The man who was never knocked down was done knocking people down forever. I was going to be her father, not a weapon. So I walked away from the title, from the money, from all of it 1 week later. People thought I was crazy. My manager wept. He was losing a fortune. The world said I was a fool, throwing away a championship. But I'd held my daughter in the hands that nearly killed a man. And I knew, with a certainty I've never once doubted since, that I was making the only choice a real man could make. Pearl or the fight. And it was never going to be the fight. People who've never had to make a choice like that don't understand it. So let me try to make them understand. Everybody told me I was throwing away a fortune. And I was a real one. The kind that buys houses and sets up grandchildren. And here's the part that sounds crazy. I knew I was throwing it away. I knew exactly what it would cost my family in dollars. And I did it anyway because some things a number can't touch. I had looked at those 2 hands holding my daughter. And I had understood all the way down that I could not be both things. I could not be the man who got into a ring and tried to render another human being unconscious for money, and also be the man I wanted my little girl to look up to. The 2 could not live in the same body. One of them had to die so the other could live, and standing there, it wasn't even a hard choice in the end, for all that it cost. The fighter died in that delivery room so the father could live. I have never, not for one single day, not even on the night $1 million was on the line, regretted which one I let go. So that's who I was the night of the party. A man who used to be a legend, who walked away to keep a promise to a newborn, who buried that whole life so deep that almost nobody in my regular world knew it had ever existed. A widower, a single dad, a guy in a catering vest working a party for rich people to put food on the table for his little girl. Now, let me tell you about that party and Camilla Rourke. Camilla Rourke was the host. a billionaire, tech and real estate, the papers said. The party was in her enormous home, the kind of place where they hire a whole staff of temporary servers for the night. And that night, one of those servers was me. I'd taken the gig because the pay was good and Pearl needed new winter boots. And there was a school trip I wanted her to be able to go on. Just a working man moving through a sea of the richest people in the city, invisible, refilling glasses. And Camilla Rourke was, I came to understand over the course of that evening, a particular kind of rich person. The kind who is so bored, so insulated, so used to the whole world bending to her, that cruelty becomes a form of entertainment. She'd had a few drinks, she was holding court with a circle of equally wealthy friends. And at some point, her gaze landed on me, the server, and she decided, the way that kind of person decides, that the help would make good sport. It started small. A comment about my vest, a joke at my expense to her friends, loud enough for me to hear, watching to see if I'd react. I didn't. I've been looked down on my whole life, before the fighting and after. You learn to let it roll off. And I want to be honest about something here, because it's part of the strength I'm trying to describe. It is not that her words didn't reach me. They did. I'm a human being, standing in a room full of people deciding you're beneath them, laughing at your vest, treating you like furniture that pours wine, that lands every time, no matter how many times you've taken it. The old me, the fighter me, had a temper. And that temper had not died with the rest of him. I just learned to keep it on a very short leash. So, when Camilla Rourke started in on me, there was a part of me, an old, buried, dangerous part, that woke up and wanted to remind that whole room exactly who they were laughing at. But that's the thing nobody tells you about real self-control. It isn't that you don't feel the pull. It's that you feel it fully, the whole hot weight of it, and you set it down anyway. Every insult that woman threw, I felt. And every one, I set down. Not because I was a saint, but because I had a 6-year-old at home, and I was not going to let a bored, rich woman's bad night turn me back into the man I'd buried for that little girl. My restraint that night wasn't weakness. It was the hardest work I did all year. But my not reacting seemed to interest her, to provoke her, and she escalated. And finally, she landed on her big idea, the one that would entertain her friends the most. She called me over, and she said, loud for the whole circle, "You look like you could use some money, sweetheart. Tell you what, let's play a game." And she gestured to the enormous man standing behind her, her bodyguard, a man built like a vault door, clearly some kind of professional muscle. And she said, "Dom here is going to punch you one time, as hard as he likes, and if you can stay on your feet, if you don't go down, I will write you a check right now for $1,000,000. One punch, $1,000,000. What do you say, sweetheart? Or are you too scared?" And the whole circle laughed and gasped and egged it on, because to them this was hilarious. The bored billionaire offering the poor server a fortune to be her human punching bag, certain he'd either be too scared to do it or would get flattened for their amusement. Either way, entertainment. Either way, a story they'd tell for weeks. The help humiliated for sport. And I stood there, and I felt the old thing wake up in me, the thing I'd put to sleep years ago, and I pushed it back down. And then, I did the math no one in that room could see me doing. $1,000,000. Do you understand what $1,000,000 is to a man like me? It's Pearl's entire future. It's a house instead of an apartment. It's college. It's never lying awake again doing the terrible arithmetic of which bill to pay. It's everything I never give my daughter on a server's wage. Hand it to me for the price of my pride and one punch from a man who I knew with total certainty could not hurt me. You have to understand the arithmetic of being a poor single father to understand why I didn't even hesitate. When you're raising a child alone on the kind of money I make, your whole life is a series of small grinding no's. No, we can't afford that. No, not this month. No, maybe next year. You become an expert at disappointing the person you love most in the world, in tiny ways every single day, and smiling while you do it so she won't feel the weight of it. Pearl had asked me that very week if she could go on a school trip, and I'd had to do the thing where you say, "We'll see," in a bright voice that you both know means no. And here was a woman for whom $1 million was a rounding error, a number she'd lose in the couch cushions, offering me that exact sum to absorb one insult I knew couldn't hurt me. To turn that down to protect my pride would have been the most expensive vanity of my life, paid for entirely by my daughter. No proud man's wounded feelings are worth a child's whole future. I set my tray down before she'd even finished the sentence, because here's what Camilla Rourke didn't know, what none of them knew. I was the man who was never knocked down. Not by professional fighters at the peak of the sport. This bodyguard, big as he was muscle, not a real fighter. I could see it in how he stood. He could hit me with everything he had, and I would not fall. I knew it the way I know my own name. They thought they were offering me a humiliation. They were actually offering me my daughter's whole future for something I knew to a certainty I could do standing in my sleep. So, I set down my tray and I said quietly, "Okay, I'll take that bet." And the circle howled with delight. I reached up and took off my catering jacket, folded it and set it on a chair. I rolled up my sleeves and squared up to take the punch. And that's when everything changed. Dom, the bodyguard, who up until that second had been looking at me with the bored contempt of a big man sizing up an easy job, got his first real look at me. At my build under that vest, the specific build of a man who'd spent muy lum years training, at the way I stood, the way I held myself, which a real fighter recognizes instantly, the way one professional recognizes another across a room. I watched Dom's face change. I watched the contempt fall off it and something else replace it. Recognition. And then, right behind the recognition, fear. There's a thing that happens between two men who've both lived in the fighting world, a kind of recognition that passes faster than words. It's in the hands, the stance, the stillness. A real fighter holds himself a certain way, even standing in line at the grocery store, even in a catering vest, even muy lum years out of the ring. The body remembers, the body keeps the language. And Dom spoke that language. He'd lived in that world, so when I rolled my sleeves and squared up, even just to stand there and take a punch, my body did the thing it knew how to do, settled into the stance it had lived in for years. And Dom read it instantly, the way you'd recognize your own mother tongue, spoken suddenly in a foreign country. He didn't see a waiter anymore. He saw what I actually was, plain as day, written in how I stood. And then I watched him do the math that Camilla Rourke couldn't do, the same math I'd done a minute earlier. But from the other side, she'd just ordered him to throw a punch at a man who could not be knocked down, and who, if he ever chose to answer, could take Dom apart. And Dom wanted no part of it, not out of cowardice, out of recognition. You don't raise your hand to a man like that. Not if you know what you're looking at, and Dom knew exactly what he was looking at. Because Dom, it turned out, had been around fighting his whole life. And Dom knew exactly who he was looking at. He'd grown up watching me. He was, he told me later, the reason he'd gotten into the sport at all. He told me, weeks afterward over coffee, that as a kid he'd had a poster of me on his wall. That he'd watched my fights over and over, not because I was flashy, I never was, but because of the not falling. Because there was something about a man who simply would not go down, that a scared kid from a hard neighborhood needed to believe was possible. He said I taught him, without ever meeting him, that you could take everything the world threw at you and still be standing. And now, here that same man was, muy lum years later, in a vest, being told to absorb a punch for a rich lady's amusement. Dom said it about broke his heart, and that refusing to throw that punch was the only way he had to pay back a debt he'd carried since he was 12. I didn't know any of that standing there. I just saw a big man's face fall apart, but that's what was behind it, and Dom stepped back. This enormous man, this professional, stepped back from me. and he turned to Camilla Rourke. The whole party watched the bodyguard's face go pale and his hands come up almost pleading, and he said, "Ma'am, please, call it off." Camilla laughed, annoyed. "Dom, don't be ridiculous. Just, ma'am," and his voice cracked. "You don't know who this is. I can't hit this man. I won't. Do you understand me? I will not put my hands on this man." And the room had gone quiet now, confused, the laughter curdling, because the Sauve van High-foot bodyguard was standing there looking like he'd seen a ghost. And Camilla, irritated, said, "Who is he?" "He's a waiter." And Dom looked at her, and he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as reverence. And he said my name, my real name, my fighting name, the one nobody at that party would have any reason to know. A couple of the older men in the circle, men who'd followed the sport, made sounds of recognition, and you could see it ripple outward as people realized, and the whole mood of that room flipped inside out in about 5 seconds. And then Dom said the thing that I'll never forget, the thing that ended it. He turned to his boss, this hired muscle, and he said, "Ma'am, this man was the greatest fighter I ever saw. He was never knocked down, not once, his whole career. You just offered him $1 million to take a punch and stay standing." He laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh. He could take a punch from anybody alive and stay standing. But that's not even the thing. The thing is, and here Dom's voice changed, got quieter, almost gentle. "The thing is, if a man like this ever decided to hit back, ma'am, there isn't enough security in this house to help you. You're not in any danger because I can see exactly what kind of man he is just by how he's standing there taking your insults." "But my God, lady, do you understand what you've been doing all night? Do you understand who you've been treating like a toy?" And the room was dead silent. Camilla Rourke looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time all night, not as a server, not as sport, but as a man. I watched the cruelty drain out of her face and something like shame creep in to replace it, because she finally understood. She'd spent the whole evening tormenting a man for fun, certain of her power over him, and it turned out the man could have ended her entire security detail with his bare hands, and had simply quietly chosen not to, had stood there and taken her cruelty like it was nothing, because he wanted to buy his daughter some winter boots. Now, here's the part that matters, and it's the part I most want you to hear. Everybody in that room, in that frozen silent moment, was waiting to see what I'd do. The powerful had just learned I wasn't powerless at all, that I was, in fact, the most dangerous man in the building. And there's a version of this story where I use that, where I make Camilla Rourke afraid, where I let that bodyguard's fear hang in the air and enjoy it, where I get my revenge for the whole humiliating night, even if just with a look, a threat, a flash of the man I used to be. Everybody expected it. In a way, everybody felt I'd earned it, but I made a promise once in a delivery room, holding a newborn in the hands that had nearly killed a man. These hands don't do that anymore, not even a little, not even when it's deserved. And I want to sit on that for a second, because this is the whole heart of the thing. It would have been so easy. It would have felt so good for about 10 seconds to draw myself up to my full height and let that whole cruel room feel, just for a moment, the cold drop in the stomach that Camilla Rourke deserved to feel. To take back, with one hard look, all the power she'd spent the night stealing from me. Nobody would have blamed me. Half that room would have secretly cheered. And here's what I've learned that most people never do. That feeling, that pull toward the satisfying cruelty you're owed, is exactly the thing you have to be strong enough to refuse. Anybody can hit back when they've been wronged. Anybody can take the revenge that's sitting right there for the taking. That's not strength. That's just gravity. That's just falling. The strength is in the not falling. It's in standing in the one place in your whole life where revenge is free and justified and applauded, and choosing anyway to keep your hands open because somewhere across town there's a little girl asleep who's going to grow up to be whatever kind of person her daddy showed her how to be. I wasn't going to let Camilla Rourke turn me cruel. That was the one thing in that whole house she didn't have enough money to buy. So I didn't draw myself up. I didn't make myself frightening. I didn't say a single hard word to Camilla Rourke, who absolutely had it coming. Instead, I walked over to Dom, the bodyguard, the man who'd refused to hit me, and I put my hand out and I shook his and I said, "Quiet, just for him." "Thank you." That took more than throwing the punch would have. Refusing your boss like that, that's the real toughness. "You're a good man, Dom." And I watched this enormous professional get tears in his eyes because the fighter he'd idolized as a kid had just called him a good man. And then I picked my catering jacket back up off the chair and I put it on. The greatest fighter that bodyguard had ever seen. Putting his server's vest back on in a silent ballroom full of billionaires. And I turned to Camilla Rourke and I said gently, with no edge in it at all, "I think I should probably get back to work, ma'am. Folks need their glasses filled." And that, I think, was the moment that undid her completely. Not fear, the opposite of fear. The sight of a man who could have frightened her, choosing instead to be gentle. Choosing to be humble. Choosing, with the whole room watching, to just go back to being the help because that's the honest work that fed his little girl. I think if I'd threatened her, she'd have felt justified somehow, would have had something to push against. But I gave her nothing to push against. I just gave her the truth of who I was, which was a far stronger and a far kinder man than she'd taken me for, and let her sit in it. Now, the $1 million. Because here's the thing, I technically won the bet. The terms were, take one punch and stay standing. No punch had been thrown, true, but only because her own man refused to throw it, having recognized that the bet was a fraud from her side. She'd offered me $1 million to do something she thought was nearly impossible, and that was for me nothing at all. I could have argued the technicality. I didn't have to, because Camilla Rourke walked over to me in front of everyone, and her hands were shaking a little, and she said, "I owe you an apology, a real one. I have treated you abominably all night, and you've shown me more grace in the last 5 minutes than I think I've shown anyone in years." And then she said, "And I'm writing you the check, not because of any bet, because I'd like to do one decent thing tonight, and because I have a feeling you'll do something better with that money than I ever would. And I want to tell you, because I know you're wondering whether I took it, that I took it. I took every penny of that $1 million, and I didn't feel one bit bad about it, and I'll tell you exactly why. Because it's the same reason I took off my jacket in the first place. That money was never about me. If it had been about me, my pride, my dignity, I'd have thrown her offer in her face hours earlier and walked out. But it was about Pearl. It was always, only about Pearl. I swallowed that whole humiliating night for my daughter's future, and to refuse the money at the end to protect my own pride would have meant the humiliation was for nothing. A proud man would have refused it. A father took it. I have never been confused about which one of those I am. I did say one thing to her when she handed me that check. I said, "Miss Rourke, can I tell you why I really took off my jacket tonight? Not because I wanted your money for me, because I've got a 6-year-old little girl at home named Pearl, and her mama passed 2 years ago, and it's just me. And $1 million is the difference between the life I can give her and the life I want to give her. That's the whole reason. I'd have let 100 men punch me for that little girl. So, thank you. You've changed her whole life tonight, even if you didn't mean to at first." And Camilla Rourke, the bored, cruel billionaire, put her hand over her mouth and turned away because I think nobody had made her feel like a human being or feel her own smallness in a very long time. That's the strange thing about people with that much money and that much armor. Everybody either fears them or wants something from them, and so nobody ever tells them the truth, and nobody ever shows them simple human decency without an angle, and they go years, decades, without anybody treating them like just a person who could be better than their being. I think, in a backwards way, the kindest thing anybody had done for Camilla Rourke in a long time was what I did that night. Refused to be afraid of her. Refused to flatter her. and refuse also to hurt her. Just stand there and be a decent man in front of her, until she couldn't help but measure herself against it. Mercy holds up a mirror that revenge never can. Revenge would have let her stay the villain of the story. Mercy made her have to look at herself. So, what happened after? Pearl is set for life. That's the first and most important thing. My little girl will go to any college she dreams of, and we live in a real house now with a yard, and I sleep at night. I still work. I'll always work. I don't know how to not work, but I work because I want to now, not because the wolf is at the door, and the money didn't change the one thing that matters, which is that I am still, first and last and always, just Pearl's dad. The man who walked away from a championship to hold her, and would do it again 1,000 times. Dom and I are friends now, the bodyguard. Funny how things go. He quit working for Camilla Rourke not long after. Saeed, he couldn't work for someone who'd do what she did, even though she'd apologized. And I helped him get into training young fighters, which is what he was always meant to do. He's good at it. He teaches those kids the same thing I'd teach them, which is that the most important thing a fighter ever learns is when not to fight. He tells them about me, I'm told. About the night the greatest fighter he ever saw took off his jacket to take a punch for his daughter, and then put it back on without throwing one. He says it's the best lesson he ever got. I think he's selling himself short. Refusing his boss took its own kind of guts. But I'm honored to be his story. And Camilla Rourke hears something I didn't expect. She changed. Not overnight, not into a saint, but she changed. She wrote me a letter some months later. She said that night was the first time in years anyone had held a mirror up to her, and that she hadn't liked what she saw, and that she'd been trying since to be a different kind of person with her money and her power. I don't know how far she got with it. People are hard to change, but I believe she meant it, and I believe a man choosing gentleness over revenge, that one night cracked something open in her that needed cracking. You never know what a little mercy is going to do to somebody. Sometimes it does more than a fist ever could. I think about that night a lot, and about what it taught me, which was just a confirmation of what I already knew but needed reminding of. Everybody in that room thought they understood power. They thought power was Camilla Rourke's money, her bodyguard, her ability to make the help dance for her amusement. And the most powerful person in that entire mansion turned out to be the quiet man in the catering vest. And his power was not in his fists, which could have ended any of them. His power was in his restraint and his choosing, with every reason in the world to do otherwise, to be gentle, to be humble, to pick his jacket back up. The strongest thing I have ever done in my life was not winning bar Muay fights undefeated. Any tough kid with fast hands can learn to win fights. The strongest thing I ever did was hold my newborn daughter and decide to never throw a punch in anger again, and then keep that promise for years. Even on a night when a room full of cruel people would have cheered me for breaking it. That's the real championship, not knocking a man down. It's having every power to knock him down and choosing for love to keep your hands open instead. That night, when I finally got home late, I paid the sitter and I went and stood in the doorway of Pearl's room and I watched my little girl sleep for a while, the way you do. And I had that $1 million check folded up in my pocket, and I thought about everything it would buy her. The whole future it had just unlocked, but mostly, I just looked at her. This small person I gave up a championship for and would give up the whole world for, and I thought about the promise I made to the hands that were holding that check, the same hands that held her the day she was born. And I went in, quiet, and I tucked her blanket up under her chin, gentle as anything, with the hands that were never going to hurt anyone again. And she stirred and said, "Daddy?" Half asleep, and I said, "I'm here, baby. Go back to sleep. Everything's good." And it was. For the first time in a long time, everything was good. So, let me ask you something before I go. We've got this idea, all of us, that strength means how much you can do to people, how hard you can hit, how much you can take, how much you can make the world bend. But I've come to believe the realest strength there is is the strength to not, to have the power to hurt and choose not to use it, to have every reason for revenge and choose mercy instead, to be able to win the fight and decide the fight isn't worth your daughter's eyes on you. So, here's my question for the comments. When have you seen someone show that kind of strength? The strength to hold back when nobody would have blamed them for letting go? Or when did you manage it yourself? Tell me. Those are the stories I most want to hear. Those are the real champions.